a section trail in the Saskatchewan grain belt, 22 miles east of a two-man Royal Northwest Mounted Police Detachment, June 1912, 7 in the morning. A constable, 4 years at this posting, turned his patrol horse off the graded road and onto the prairie a quarter-mile before the slough crossing, without slowing and without looking at the water. RNWMP patrol reports for comparable districts in this decade document exactly this kind of decision, made without comment, dozens of times in a single week of patrol. The crossing looked passable. It was June, the trail was dry, and a rider new to the district would have taken it. The constable did not, because in his first spring at this posting, the horse had gone into the hocks at that crossing, and because he had learned, the way everything in this work was learned, that the June surface of that particular slough margin said nothing about what was underneath it. This is what a mounted prairie patrol actually was between 1900 and the mid-1930s, in the last era before the automobile made it obsolete. Not the red surge on a parade square. A man and a horse covering a district of several hundred square miles of homestead country, alone, out of contact with the detachment from the moment they left it until the moment they returned, sometimes the same evening, often days later. The horse was the patrol's transport, its endurance limit, its daily 2 hours of labor before the patrol even began, and, on a bad trail in a wet spring, the thing whose judgment the constable had learned to weigh against his own. The institution behind him could give him a horse, a carbine, a notebook, and a list of settlers' names. What it could not give him was the knowledge of which slough crossing lied in June, that he had to build himself, one district, one season, one mistake at a time, and when he was transferred, it left with him. So begin with the obvious question, the one the institution itself never wrote down an answer to. What exactly was the system that put this constable and this horse on this trail? How did the mounted police organize a territory the size of Western Europe into districts a single rider could hold? And why, as late as 1912, with the automobile already invented and already for sale in Regina, was the horse still the entire answer? The system had a designer and a date. In the late 1880s, Commissioner Lawrence Herchmer reorganized the mounted police around a simple principle. Distribute the members as widely as possible, assign them to small detachments inside each division, and require regular patrols with weekly reports. The patrol system's product was not arrests. It was awareness, a standing, constantly refreshed picture of conditions across a policing territory so large that no headquarters could otherwise see it at all. Every settler visited, every trail ridden, every brand checked and prairie fire noted went into the weekly report, and the weekly reports, stacked in Regina, were the closest thing the institution had to a map of what was actually happening on the ground. The horse was not a tradition inside that system. It was the load-bearing component. A patrol district in the grain belt might run 40 miles on a side, crossed by trails that were graded road for a few miles and pure prairie for the rest, cut by sloughs, coulees, and creek crossings that no wheeled vehicle of 1912 could negotiate in a wet month. The force had, in fact, already bought its first automobile, a 7-passenger McLaughlin, and the car would eventually end everything this channel is describing. But in 1912, the car was a headquarters machine for graded roads in dry weather. The district belonged to the horse, and would for another 2 decades of declining but real operational work, until the last regular horse patrols in the late 1930s. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer who rode or drove the same district in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era, not Mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What did 4 years of riding the same 60 miles of prairie give a constable and his horse that no motor vehicle, no radio, and no map has ever been designed to carry? And if you served in the RCMP or provincial police in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If your grandfather or great-grandfather rode a patrol district for the RNWMP, the RCMP, or an early provincial force? Which detachment, which district, and what did he know about it that never went into a patrol report? Next on this channel, the RCMP dog sled patrols of the Northwest Territories and the 1910-11 Lost Patrol, which documented in 4 graves what happens when the territory knowledge is not on the sled. Back on the trail, the system gave the constable a horse and a district. But the horse was not standard issue equipment that waited in a rack. It was a working animal that had to be fed, watered, groomed, shod, and judged. Every day, patrol or no patrol. What did the horse actually demand of the man before the district demanded anything at all? The answer to what the horse demanded is in the detachment's daily routine, and RCMP standing orders and divisional histories for this era document it plainly. The horse came first, before breakfast, before the report, before whatever the district had produced overnight, the stable. Feeding, watering, grooming, the inspection of legs, hooves, and shoes that a rider learned to do with his hands as much as his eyes. Force tradition put it bluntly. You weren't a Mountie unless you could ride, and Regina drilled equitation into every recruit for exactly this reason. But riding was the smallest part of it. The recruit learned in his first prairie posting that he had not been issued a vehicle. He had been issued a dependency. A patrol horse that threw a shoe 40 miles out was not an inconvenience. It was the end of the patrol, and possibly a lead horse walk home. So the constable carried spare shoes and nails and learned rough farrier work. A horse worked too hard in July heat was unusable in August, so the constable learned pace, the alternating walk and trot that could produce 40 or 50 miles in a day without breaking the animal, and the judgment about when even that was too much. Grain and hay had to be found on multi-day patrols, which meant the patrol route itself was partly planned around feed, which settler had oats, which stopping place had a stable, where the good slough water was in a dry August. The horse's requirements were laced through every operational decision the rider made, and after a few years the 2 sets of judgment, his and the animal's, ran together. A horse that balked at a crossing it had taken before was telling him something. An experienced district man had learned when to listen. None of this was in a manual as territory. The manual covered stable management. It did not cover this district's feed map, this horse's particular honesty about bad ground, the way this animal's ears worked a farmyard where something was wrong. That was built the same way the slough knowledge was built, by repetition, in one place, over years. Which raises the larger question this channel keeps returning to. The horse knowledge and the ground knowledge were only 2 layers of what 4 years at one posting had put into this constable. What did he carry about the district itself? The families, the seasons, the trails in October versus the trails in March? And what did the weekly report format, with its columns for miles ridden and settlers visited, structurally never ask him to write down? Before you can understand what the weekly report never asked for, you need to understand what a homestead district in 1912 actually was. It was not a settled countryside. It was a grid of quarter sections in every stage of arrival. Families 2 months off the boat, and families 10 years established. Sod shacks next to frame houses. Languages from half of Europe. No telephone beyond the town. No doctor within 30 miles. And a mounted police constable who was, for most practical purposes, the entire visible presence of the Canadian state. The patrol report counted his miles and his visits. What it never asked for was what the visits accumulated into. Here is what the narrator can say from inside that knowledge, because the divisional histories and the memoirs of long-posted men say it consistently. After 4 years, the constable did not ride into a farmyard cold. He knew which family was one bad harvest from destitution, and which quarrel between neighbors over a line fence was 20 years old and imported from the old country. He knew which homesteader's wife had not been seen in town since the winter, and that this was worth a detour. He knew that a certain trail was fine in October and a killing trap in a March thaw, that the German Catholic settlement and the Ukrainian settlement took their disputes to different informal authorities before anyone came to him, and that a prairie fire smoke line in the northwest meant a specific set of farms in its path and a specific set of hands who would already be plowing fire guards. The district was in him, the way a person knows the rooms of their own house, not because they were told, but because they have moved through them in the dark. The institution relied on this knowledge absolutely and recorded it nowhere. When the constable was transferred, and transfers were routine, his replacement inherited the detachment, the horse, the district map, and the files. He did not inherit the 4 years. He started at the slough crossing that looked passable in June, but the visited settler columns of the report conceal one more thing, and it is the hardest part of this history. The district the constable knew by name did not only contain homesteaders. What was the mounted police's actual, documented relationship with the indigenous communities of the prairie in these same decades? The communities on whose treaty lands this entire grid had been laid. The honest answer requires holding 2 documented facts in the same frame, because both are true of the same force, the same decades, and often the same riders. The first is the record this channel has been describing, the patrol system, the settler visits, the accumulated territory knowledge, the genuine community function of a known officer in an unfinished country. The second is this. From 1885, the mounted police enforced the pass system on the prairie, a segregation practice, run with the Department of Indian Affairs, that required First Nations people to obtain written permission to leave their own reserves, stating destination, purpose, and duration. It had no basis in law. Commissioner Herchmer, the same Herchmer who built the patrol system, ordered enforcement stopped in 1893 for exactly that reason, and then resumed it under pressure from the Indian Commissioner. It continued, in practice, for decades. In the same era, the force assisted Indian agents in compelling children's attendance at residential schools. After the 1920 Indian Act Amendment made attendance mandatory, the act formally designated the police as truant officers, empowered to search out children and return them, sometimes forcibly, to the schools. The force also enforced the federal bans on ceremonies, the potlatch, the sun dance, the gatherings that the Indian Act had criminalized. This is not a footnote to the mounted patrol story. It was mounted patrol work. The same horse, the same trail knowledge, the same ability to reach a distant community in any season that made the constable valuable to the Homestead family made him effective at riding onto a reserve to check passes or collect a child. The territory knowledge this channel documents was real, and it served everything the institution asked of it, the prairie fire and the pass system alike. Indigenous communities on the prairie knew the mounted policeman as a figure whose arrival could mean help, and whose arrival could mean the removal of their children. Both memories are documented. Both are accurate. The channel's rule stands. Neither the mythology nor the erasure. The rider on the slough trail was a man with genuine, hard-built operational knowledge, embedded in an institution whose full record includes what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would later document at length. Hold that whole picture, because the next question is mechanical, and it is coming fast. In 1912, the horse still owned the district. Within a decade, it would not. What, exactly, did the automobile do to the mounted patrol? And why did the transition take 20 years instead of 2? The transition took 20 years for 2 reasons, and only one of them was mechanical. The mechanical reason first. The automobile of the 1910s was a fair-weather, graded road machine in a district that was mostly neither. Prairie gumbo after rain would mire a car to the axles where a horse walked through. Spring breakup closed the trails to wheels for weeks. Winter drifts stopped a car dead at the first cut. A horse could break through, or go around, or be led. The car had no heater, a crank start that grew treacherous in hard cold, and a range fixed by fuel that did not grow beside the trail the way horse feed did. On the graded roads near town, the car was already faster than any horse ever foaled. Off them, and the district was mostly off them, it was cargo. The second reason was the work itself. The patrol was not a transit between incidents. The patrol was the visit, and the visit was built at a horse's pace. The constable who rode into a farmyard stabled his horse, and stabling took time, and time meant a meal at the kitchen table, and the meal was where the district's information actually lived. Who was sick, who was struggling, who had not been seen. RNWMP divisional histories describe the mounted man carrying messages and mail between farms, giving first aid, warning of weather and fire, standing as witness and informal mediator in disputes that never became charges, precisely because a known man had arrived slowly and stayed. In a town of 400 people, the constable knew every household, which was also the complication, because he policed people who ate at his table. The horse-paced visit was the operating system of that relationship. A car could do the road. It could not, at first, do the district. But while the horse still held the trails, the institution above the rider was coming apart and being rebuilt. Between 1914 and 1920, the force fought a war, nearly dissolved, and emerged with a new name and a new headquarters 1,000 miles from the prairie. What happened to the mounted police in those 6 years? And where did the upheaval leave the district rider and his horse? The war reached the district through the detachment door. From 1914, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police took on border patrols, surveillance of so-called enemy aliens, and national security enforcement across the West, while squadrons of its members went overseas, mounted men from prairie detachments riding in France, and, in 1918, in Siberia. The district patrols thinned, and when the war ended, the force itself nearly did. Policing, under the Constitution, was provincial business, and in 1917, the force withdrew from provincial contract work. Alberta and Saskatchewan stood up their own provincial police forces to take the districts over. For a moment, the institution that had built the prairie patrol system faced dissolution. Instead, in February 1920, it absorbed the Dominion Police, took responsibility for federal statutes from coast to coast, moved its headquarters from Regina to Ottawa, and took a new name, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The Prairie District Rider of the 1920s, in Saskatchewan or Alberta, was now often a provincial policeman in a different uniform, working the same trails. The RCMP kept the federal files. The knowledge did not care whose shoulder flash carried it, but the institutional thread of the long posting had been cut once, and would be cut again. Meanwhile, the ground itself was changing under the horse. Through the 1920s, the municipalities graded and graveled. The grain truck arrived. The telephone lines walked out from the towns along the section roads. The force's motor fleet grew year by year, and the arithmetic turned brutal. On an all-weather road, a car did in one afternoon what a horse patrol did in 3 days. The horse's remaining kingdom was shrinking to the seasons and the places wheels could not go. Breakup, drift, and the last unfenced country. The stable was still full in 1925. It was full the way a lamp is full of oil after the wiring has gone in. Then, in 1928, the original arrangement returned. Saskatchewan signed the first provincial policing contract with the RCMP, and the force absorbed the provincial police and came back to the districts it had left a decade before. What world did it come back to, and how many years did the patrol horse have left in it? The RCMP came back to a district in trouble. In 1928, it absorbed the Saskatchewan Provincial Police under the first provincial contract. In 1932, Alberta, Manitoba, and 3 eastern provinces followed, and the force became the working police of most of rural Canada. What it returned to police was the Depression Prairie. Drought, dust, failed sections, families leaving land their fathers had broken, transient men riding the freights between relief camps. The same institution, in the same decade, was also the instrument of labor policing. The confrontation with the On to Ottawa trekkers in Regina in 1935 belongs to this force and this era, and this channel will document it on its own terms. The district riders' world and the strike squad's world were the same organization's world. Both are the record. Inside that record, the horse was finishing its working life. The 1930s patrol car had a heater, a battery start, and 40 miles an hour on gravel that now reached most of the district most of the year. The horse's assignments narrowed to what they had always been at the core: breakup, drift, and the country past the road's end. Detachment stables that had held 4 horses held 2, then 1, then hay for no one. Equitation stayed at Regina. The force never stopped teaching its recruits to ride, but the district horse became, posting by posting, a memory with a name. The last regular horse patrols were ridden in the late 1930s. 2 years later, the RCMP's motor fleet stood at more than 540 vehicles, and the animal that had carried the force onto the prairie in 1874 carried it nowhere at all, except in the musical ride and on the badge. The institution's own histories record the change as modernization, and by every measurable standard it was: faster response, wider coverage, lower cost per mile. The measurements were true. They measured miles. So end where this channel always ends, with what the measurements did not measure. When the stable emptied and the district man rolled his last patrol at 40 miles an hour with the windows up, what, exactly, did the district lose? What the district lost was pace, and everything pace had produced. The car did not just move faster than the horse, it knew differently. The mounted constable had crossed his district at the speed at which ground can be read and people can be talked to. 20 miles on a horse was a day of surfaces under hoof. Smoke lines noted, gates opened, kitchens sat in. 20 miles in a sedan was 20 minutes of windshield. The visits continued. The force still visited, but the visit was no longer the shape of the work, and the slow accumulation that had put the district inside the man began arriving thinner with every posting. The institution had not decided to discard the knowledge. It had decided to buy speed, and the knowledge had been priced at nothing, because nothing was where it appeared in the ledger. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories, and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more grid roads, more northern detachments, more dog sled crossings, more family calls with 3 pieces of information the dispatch did not contain, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. What did 4 years of riding the same 60 miles of prairie give a constable and his horse that no motor vehicle, no radio, and no map was ever designed to carry? And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, a detachment, put it in the comments. If anyone in your family rode a district for the RNWMP, the RCMP, or a provincial force, name the detachment and the district, and tell us what he knew about it that never went into a report. Next on this channel, the RCMP dog sled patrols of the Northwest Territories, and the 1910-11 Lost Patrol, which documented in 4 graves what happens when the territory knowledge is not on the sled. The last regular horse patrols were ridden in the late 1930s. The detachment stables were converted, one by one, into garages. What the motor fleet gave the RCMP: speed, coverage, cost per mile that no stable could match. What it did not give the district: a rider who knew, from 4 years and 1 mistake, which slough crossing lied in June. The sedan that took the section road past that crossing knew the road from the map. It got where it was going. The crossing was not on its route, because the route was the road now. The constable had known the crossing. He had learned it in his first spring, the way everything in that work was learned. Nobody asked him what he knew before the stable became a garage. The slough still lies the same way in June. The road has been paved. The knowledge is somewhere else now.